Set 10 Remix Rumble with the new mechanic of headliners makes it feel like there's almost too many different things that you can do in the game. So what are the best comps right here, right now? Well, luckily, I've been grinding PB nonstop over the past 2 weeks to find out what are the S tier best compositions for you to try out and get started in Set 10. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's also an entire A and B tier that I'll cover in a future video, but I didn't want to make you watch a 1.52 hour long intro video just to play the set. So that's going to be coming out later if you want more information. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we start, I want to give a shout out to my sponsor, Mobalytics, who is helping bring you guys this video. Mobalytics is a dedicated data website to help you find the analysis and edge you need to climb. Check out their stuff at mobalytics.gg/TFT, where you can find compositions by myself, Dishop, and many other top players in North America. By downloading their overlay, you can get meta comps in-game, as well as look at different community comps and my own compositions I'm using to climb. It's also the overlay that I use that recommends me real-time data of augments as well as other information happening in the lobby so that I can stay up to date. Download the app so you can get your best set 9.5 comps in-game with the Mobalytics overlay. The first comp that I want to talk about is Akali Karthus. Akali Karthus is a really powerful dual comp, specifically the KDA version of Akali, because Akali's going to zip through the backline and assassinate units alongside Karthus that deals big damage to the lowest enemy health units. This usually means that Karthus casts and Akali finishes up. And if Akali doesn't end up killing them, Karthus' second cast will be able to also clean up a bunch of units. So together, this is actually one of the only ways that you can consistently assassinate backline units in the game. And because there's a lot of front-to-back compositions currently where they play like a bunch of sentinels, bruisers, guardians, etc., and they have a carry in the backline, usually you can just deal with, you know, that Ezreal, that Lucian, that Jhin, however you want to name it. Very, very effective. 3 to 5 pentakill doesn't really matter as long as you have 3, so you can get that team-wide bonus, especially if you get that 5th kill, so all the pentakill champions gain attack speed. If you're playing Karthus, you generally want pentakill because you're not going to be able to get that follow-up cast very quickly, and because you tend to AoE wipe, so you get that 5th kill pretty quickly, and then you can empower him to do a lot more. Mordekaiser 3 is very strong, so if you do end up going for Akali Karthus, Mord is usually the tank you stack, but if you don't have like Mord 3 because he's very contested and other people are picking up pentakill and sentinels, just also give additional items to like Nico, for example. You can have like a double tank and you can end up having a lot more support that way. Don't try to go too crazy and roll for Mordekaiser 3. Just remember that Akali Karthus are the stars of the composition, and if you can get Mordekaiser 3, great, but a lot of times you can't. Remember that KDA is not the important trait for Akali to activate. You don't always have to get these hexes, and sometimes these hexes do some kind of weird like spread out stuff. I mean, you might get like the social distancing one. I don't think it looks like exactly like this, but you get the point. Make sure you play Akali in the second row and that she's ready to dash to the corner opposite of where the enemy carry is. Let's say your opponent is playing like, you know, this Corki represents their carry. Have Akali on the opposite side because she's going to dash through. She's going to go through this entire board and try to kill that backline unit. Karthus cast, and that's how you take care of them. Executioners are also the flexible trait that you can also go from 2 to 4. Let's say you have a headliner that has Executioner Karthus. Usually you can play another 3 cost like a Samira or a Vex in order to just get that backline damage. I personally like Vex the most because Vex also has a stun associated with her ability, so definitely try to play around it if you can. The nice thing about Superfan is that you just pretty much need 3. We have 4 included here, so you can get like that pentakill synergy, but if you don't have Gnar and that Viego, totally fine to just play around these core units, for example, if you have like a +1 executioner. But ultimately, you just really need a basic set of units, and you don't really need to do anything more than this. In terms of the priority list, you want to make sure that Karthus always has mana item plus AP. The most important mana item is Shojin for Karthus, and if you don't have that, you can just play like an adaptive helm instead. Also, it's not necessarily a bad thing to double stack mana items onto Karthus because as he's able to cast multiple times, he's going to do less damage, but because he's casting more often, you should be able to get up that pentakill bonus pretty quickly. And then for Akali, the most important item for her is Edge of Night because she ends up drawing a lot of aggression, so you want to make sure she's safe and doesn't get blasted by units that lock onto her. If your opponent's playing like a 3-star backline carry of some kind, they lock onto Akali, she's likely going to die and not be able to draw up that aggro fast enough for her to dash through. In general, you want to put any other AD item onto her on top of Edge of Night. Bloodthirster is just an example, but you know, Edge of Night plus IE and Hand of Justice can also be like a really, really lethal combo. This is my favorite build on Akali because that sustain and crit is very, very difficult to deal with. In terms of frontline items, it can be like really whatever. This BT Titans on Mordekaiser is just a recommendation, but personally, I also really like the combination of Warmogs plus the new item Steadfast Art, which is very, very good. It's basically like like turning your unit into a juggernaut if you played set 9 where you just get straight up damage reduction. And it's really, really beneficial on these units that have things like Crown Guard and Warmog's armor because they get a lot of shielding and health. If you were to ask me what the best headliner is specifically, I think Karthus is the best so that you can get that actual damage, but Akali is a good secondary. So if you were to choose one or the other, I would go for that. I want to give a shout out to Emo Karthus. It's particularly powerful because Emo works by your allies dying and getting reduced mana so that way you can cast faster. That ends up being very good with the 4 execution on Vex. So if you're able to get this online, it is very, very powerful. You can also put KDA emblem also on Karthus, and this ends up being much better if you play vertical KDA, which we'll cover in a little bit. But overall, this is the closest thing you can do to playing assassins and rogues in this current set. So if you really love backline access, this is probably going to be one of the best comps for you to play. The second comp that I think is very good in the S tier is KDA SpellWeaver Flex. This is a composition that I think plays very interestingly because you can actually play 3-5-7 KDA and obviously 10, and you can play 3-5-7 and obviously 10 SpellWeaver depending on what you're hitting. In general, I'm going to go with the vertical KDA version because I think it's also very versatile based off Akali. And you might be sensing a theme where if you look at the priority list, it looks basically the same thing as the Karthus, where you play mana plus AP, ideally blue buff onto Ahri, but sometimes you go like Shojin or Adaptive Helm, totally fine on her. And the AP items can definitely be flexible. Like say you don't have Jewel Gauntlet, but you can go for say a Death Cap on her. Even though you have a bunch of AP from SpellWeaver, sometimes it's okay, or even a Gunblade. What we can often do is mass up a ton of gold, make sure you build around Akali, and then roll for your headliner. And if it's headliner Ahri, play more around KDA and SpellWeavers. And if it's Karthus, play more around executioners and pentakill. And these two comps already demonstrate to you the versatility of what this set has to offer because there's a lot of different things that you can do. Let's say, for example, you hit a headliner SpellWeaver Ahri, then instead of say playing around the entirety of KDA and the Superfan, you drop like these two units. And now that you have 5 KDA SpellWeaver, you can go ahead and lean more into it. You can play Gragas, for example, and Tekken Lulu. Now you have a little bit more of a versatile board with less dead units because, as you know, Lilia and Kennen don't really do a lot of things individually in the late stages of the game, so you can upgrade with higher quality. This is like one of several things that you can do to introduce a lot of versatility to the comp. In terms of positioning, this is just an example of how you play like around the pyramid or the A version of KDA. As a general rule of thumb, KDA is always in the pattern of the letters. If you actually look at all the variations of KDA, it's either spotlight oriented spread out stuff, or it's actually spelling out the letters K, D, and A, which is a little bit abstract, but you have to zoom really far out. Trust me on this one. Same thing as usual, make sure Akali is on the opposite side of your opponent's corner carry, Ahri in the back, then units like Sona and Seraphine also in the back. Seraphine's often the AP item holder early on that you used to layer into Ahri, so make sure you hold an extra copy of Seraphine. This is also doubly true if you hit a Seraphine headliner early because you're probably tempted to sell those extra Seraphines, but hold on to 1 or 2 just in case. So that way, when you find Ahri, you can transfer those items and feel like you still have the synergies intact. As a general rule of thumb, the most important breakpoints are 3 and 7 for KDA and SpellWeaver, and almost every other composition actually. From 0 to 3 is where you get the biggest spike because let's say, for example, you get SpellWeaver. That's when your whole team gets ability power, so it's a huge spike, and then the SpellWeavers also get that ability cast. But if you add 2 more SpellWeavers, you only get 15 AP, which is not that big of a deal. Then when you go to 7, you now get basically like double AP per cast, and you get a huge spike. And this also applies to a lot of other things like KDA and pentakill and true damage and whatnot. The jump from the first to the second breakpoint is not really worth it in terms of trying to chase, but it's a nice bonus. But the jump from the first and the third wrongs are usually the best. Another thing you have to be really, really careful about late game is where you position your Ahri. A lot of times when people are playing things like this Alawi and they have these tentacles, they end up positioning their tentacles on the edges and put like Alawi in the center. If you put Ahri in the corner, she's going to target these tentacles, and if Alawi casts, this tentacle will revive, which means that Ahri's going to spend a lot of her big burst single target damage on these tentacles that effectively don't do anything but just body block for the actual champions that matter. And this also applies to things like target dummies and other bait units if people are playing things like crowd divers or emo. So just be very careful where you position your Ahri. Positioning matters a lot this set, and so make sure Ahri is on the weakest target or a tank that you want to snipe immediately. And for this very reason, sometimes you want to tank bust. Totally fine to play like a Giant Slayer also onto this Ahri so she can take down this tank. In terms of frontline items, again, it doesn't really matter very much. Vow and Stoneplate are just examples here, but you know, Warmogs and Steadfast Heart, Bramble, Declaw, all those are still very, very valuable. Redemption's still really solid if you end up playing around Guardians and Sentinels and Bruisers. Totally cool. The last of the S tier compositions is a comp that you're not going to actually hit really often, but you're probably going to lose to, which is a Jazz Flex with a bunch of legendaries and 5 costs. Here's an example board of how you play Jazz based on the recommendation from the tier list, which you play, you know, vertical Jazz. Let's say you hit a headliner Lucian Jhin, or maybe you're still playing that Misfortune from a while ago, and then you get to level 9 and you're rolling for things like 2-star Alawi, 2-star Ziggs, 2-star Sona, 2-star Lucian, 2-star Yorick, so on and so forth. The most important thing to understand is you need lots, and I mean lots of money. You basically got to be Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk in order to afford this composition and be really far ahead. If you try to fast 9 without the proper augment support, right amount of HP, you are probably going to die and not stabilize with enough gold. Even if you have 40 gold and you're rolling at level 9, chances are you build a board at 1/3 the strength level. Because just think about it. If you find a headliner and it costs 15 gold, right there, that's half your economy gone, and that's only for 1 unit. So remember, this composition in general takes a ton of money. I can't even emphasize that enough. So usually you play for this if, one, you're super far ahead because you're streaking with a bunch of compositions or tempo that like is really, really good. Or 2, you end up playing like a really strong econ strategy like Level Up or Hedge Fund or something else similar to that. Anyways, more on this composition. Make sure you have 1 full set of tank items for a 2-star 5 cost. Ideally, it's Alawi, but you can put it on other units like a 2-star Zac or a 2-star Thresh. The first thing I want to emphasize for items is to make sure that you have a full set of them. Make sure you have 1 full set of tank items and 1 full set of AD items. And the tank items are very flexible because let's say instead of this Yorick, Thresh, and Set, instead you can play for say a Zac, so you get that Bruiser, and you can play Sentinels with a Blitzcrank and then an Echo. And then maybe you're not playing around this big shot, and then let's say instead of finding this Misfortune, you play around another Spellweaver like Lulu, and all of a sudden you have 3 Spellweaver plus this 2 Hyper Pop. You have them buff the Ziggs, and you put Ziggs in the middle, and now all of a sudden you have a different variation of the comp. So Jazz is like a very free-flowing and flexible trait, and I'm smiling because that's exactly what Jazz is supposed to do in the Power Fantasy. Ryan did a really good job at chest, but I think it's really cool to see all different kinds of Jazz boards succeed, depending on just anchoring off of a really strong frontline unit as well as a really strong backline unit. Make no mistake though, Alawi is the best frontline unit to play, and I believe Lucian is the best backline AD carry to play. But if you end up getting a situation where, let's say, you just get no AP items and you're not playing around Ziggs and Sona and Lulu, maybe instead you play for a Misfortune and a Jhin instead, because Misfortune is that big shot, and then you're able to get that Jhin in, and you can play for something like this, and then you can take in a different units. So let's see here, we got a Dazzler and an EDM, so let's just take in a Lux, and all of a sudden you get more traits active again, and now you can put your second set of AD items onto Jhin, whether it's like all these different things you can put on. Many different variations, and that's why it's S tier, because it's so powerful and plays around the best units in the game. But it's also like a conditional S tier with an asterisk because it's so difficult to get to this board. The only players that I really expect to do this are people who are hyper greedy and also really fundamentally sound, because they are able to leverage their early game board strength so much to get a ton of economy. The win rate of this composition should be in the 20s or better. It's going to be one of the highest win rate comps that you always see in the stat sites performing well, but you're like, how do I get to this board? The reality is you just have to play a lot of different compositions that transition into it. If you're playing like the rapid fire comp that we talk about, or big shots or whatever, you have these AMs that transition into it. You can even play a reroll comp into it. Let's say you find a reroll Kaisa and you're hitting big shots, and then all of a sudden you're like, wow, I'm so far ahead, I should get to level 9. What do? You sell that 3 cost reroll chosen that you have, you sell that 3 cost headliner that you've got to carry you to level 9, and then you look for things like the 2-star Lucian and that 2-star Jhin. If this is all just a bunch of mumbo jumbo in terms of like, what do I do? Just watch like a really good player like Dishope or Setsuko, and then you'll see exactly what I'm talking about when they're like, hey, this reroll comp got me really far, but now it's time to ditch this 3-star unit and play for a higher cap. Let's talk about reroll compositions that are also in the S tier. The first I want to talk about is Katarina Crowd Divers. I'm pretty sure this is going to be the most dominant reroll composition in the game. Radiance is likely going to hold rank 1 for 28 minutes once more, like he always does, because 2-star Katarina is back in S tier and is quite fearsome. This is a composition where hitting the Crowd Diver variation of Katarina is way better than the country, but you can't be too picky. And in general, in terms of how you're approaching reroll comps, you can't be that picky with variation of the trait that gets double the bonus, because oftentimes you're not going to find that unit for a very long time if you pass it. Katarina's best items in general are crit items, kind of like you're building her like an assassin or a rogue from the previous sets. Dual Gauntlet and 2 Hodges is totally fine, but you can also go for some bonus damage items as well, like Giant Slayer if you really need. I've even seen people put Shojin on her or other weird items like a Nashor's Tooth because she doesn't have that much mana for her cast. You can totally find a lot of different items you can just find to her. Also, don't forget you can always just put things like Rabadon's Death Cap cap and crown guard just for the straight up AP. These are the core units you want to roll for at level 6 minus Zed and Kiana, and then at level 7 and 8 you basically tag around their synergies and add in things like that Zed and that Kiana. You can also play around country instead of the super fan. The super fan is just a recommendation because that trait in general is just really strong and efficient and probably too OP. They're gonna have to nerf it. You can play around Tom Kench, for example, and an early Urgot or a Samira in the back, and you can totally just play this to get early stats as well. So the thing about Katarina reroll as you're trying to roll on 6 is that you have a lot of different packages they can play. The traditional way that a lot of people think about is like playing around the country so that you get like, you know, the free Dreadsteed up the Hecarim, and then you get a lot of extra bodies on board with stats so you can preserve HP. You can also play that super fan version that we talked about, which, you know, gives Katarina that free item and also kind of links together really nicely. Maybe even find a way to play it all if you like have a +1 country Katarina and then you just take an Urgot so you have Mosher with Gnar. There's a lot of different things that you could theoretically play with it, and that's what makes reroll comps really interesting, I think, in this set, because even within this Katarina you can see that there's like 2.5, 3 different variations that I just mentioned, and there's actually even more if you dive into it. But I actually think reroll actually has a lot of nuance in terms of how you can min-max and optimize the strength. A lot of times you end up playing this line mainly when you have like an Evelynn starting core and you feel like you have, you know, a headliner Evelynn with Crowd Diver or KDA. You give her the Jewel Gauntlet and that Hand of Justice or other things equivalent to it, and then you're able to actually have her carry for a while, get to level 6, sell her, roll, hit that Katarina. Oh, it turns out you collected 2 Katarinas already and you had that headliner, you have 5 Katarinas. You know, maybe you hit something like team building and then you hit Katarina 3 out of nowhere. That's usually how this composition operates, and it's very strong when that happens. But if you have Jewel Gauntlet Hodge and you don't have the Evelynn chosen, you can just put it on pretty much any AP carry that makes a lot of sense early game, like even an Annie or possibly a Nami, and then just like slowly tech into it if you really want to. Currently the best S tier composition of reroll comps is Misfortune Jazz Flex. Misfortune is a really powerful 3 cost that gets along very quickly because at level 7 you just have very clean synergies across the board. This is actually your level 7. You just take out Lucian and you don't have rapid fire, and you get a really cheap core of super fans alongside things like the Bard and the Kaisa for Jazz Dazzler and that KDA Big Shot, and you also have this Echo to tie in that synergy as well. And as you can look, it's such a clean level 7 where you get 7 synergies online, and it's a really nice package overall that makes MF really strong. And here's the extra bonus: you actually have a flexibility of playing around Bard as your headliner as well. Bard's headliner bonus says that for each 8 dudes you cast per game, you get an additional dude. This means that the longer the game goes, Bard gets stronger and stronger, and he starts to snowball, and he gets a permanent buff to his ability. So by the end of the game, if you're able to get things like, you know, the Shojin, Archangels, things like Adaptive Helm is also really good at it as well. The more he's able to cast, the better. You're able to snowball that and get a Bard 3 online that's casting 7, 8 extra dudes that ends up snowballing to a top 2. And so this core package is extremely strong, so don't sleep on it. The cool thing about it is that you actually have a lot of options with how you open. If you get like a Misfortune out of the box, obviously you can play around that to start things off, but you can also just simply play around Corki and Kaisa with these items and slam things like Rageblade and that Last Whisper on Misfortune, and then play around concepts like a Corki with a Kaisa having these items, and then playing around Garen with like Lilia and the Superfan package. This is a really easy way you can get this online level 6, and then you can start adding things like the Echo and Misfortune later on when you hit. If you're rolling for Bard, you roll at 6. If you're rolling Misfortune, you roll at 7. And positioning is pretty straightforward. Just make sure that your units don't get swarmed and you're able to play like a pretty spread out backline like this. So after half a day of games and stats, we've kind of figured out that this is the best version of the country board where you play around Samira, Last Whisper, IE, and AD still, but you really still want to focus on having that Amumu and that Vex for that core 3 unit. But again, going back to that core principle is that you really just need Samira and a good amount of frontline with that country. So in the ideal world, you have Amumu and Vex, but it's not the end of the world if you don't get it, because you can still rely on that Urgot. So in the end, just make sure to play around whatever you get and ultimately flex around that headliner. If you're stuck, for example, playing a Infernal Contract game for some whatever reason, or let's say you are playing Threes a Crowd, this is actually something that you can think about as a way to build out. But in reality, you end up a lot of times at the top end cutting these units and playing for things like a Yorick instead, because you have that Mosher, and then maybe you end up playing even more around that Mosher or a little bit less. Like maybe you cut this Bruiser and instead you just tech in some other backline units that can do really well, you know, like Ziggs or like random Lucian. You have a lot of options you can do at level 9. You can also play around even more executioners if you want to. I've definitely seen people go for, say, like Karthus and Akali. It's a little on the greedy end to try to go for like the executioner, especially if you hit like this headliner executioner on Samira. It's very, very difficult to pull off because you just don't have that many items. And in the end, you have to remember that you still need frontline items. One common scenario that you can actually pull this off, though, is if you find a way to play Lucky Gloves. If you find Lucky Gloves, you can have Lucky Gloves on Samira, Lucky Gloves on Akali, Lucky Gloves on Karthus, and that's 3 items. And that should theoretically get you to a spot where you can play like 4 carries. And because they're executioners, they benefit off that additional critical strike chance. And so you'll be able to find a way to itemize everybody. That's just one variation that you can play. Who's a better headliner between Samira and Urgot? The reality is you're probably just going to pick the first one that you can get because you need that tempo. In terms of the early game, like I said, the condition is often like an early Urgot or an early Samira. You play the Tom Kench and you pick up things like the Katarina so you can get that country. And then you play around 3 country for a long time. Try to get 5 whenever you can, but flex around their trade. So get an extra executioner like maybe a Twitch in the early game to help amplify a Samira if you're playing around Samira. Do something like this. In terms of the early game, you a lot of times play based off of like whatever you get out of early box. So let's say you're playing around Samira, you just play like a Twitch and maybe play like a Pantheon and you get like, you know, free cheap punk that way. But if you also have an opportunity to play around this Mosher instead, you can go for like Gnar and you kind of probably know where I'm going with this. You go Lilia and Kennen, and then you find a super fan and voila, you know, you have a pretty good spot with super fan Moshers and a country, assuming one of them is +1 country on the headliner. A lot of really powerful early game that is really, really solid that you should think about, but primarily off of a 3-cost orb that drops you one of these powerful units like Urgot and Samira. Senna reroll is very, very strong, in particular when you start off with an early Senna 2 of some kind. Senna 2 is just very, very powerful and overstated. And here's the kicker. You don't even really need rapid fire on her. It just gives her a little bit of extra attack speed, but you know, it's not that really important. You want to build more around the true damage aspect than the rapid fire. Although if you do end up getting a true damage emblem, you end up putting that onto a Caitlyn because true damage Caitlyn is exceptionally good. If that ends up happening, you probably end up just dropping like either the Akali or you're probably not getting this Kiana either. Your tank items are going to be on Echo in general, and Echo is going to just kind of take whatever you can get. You know, same thing as usual. Bramble Declaw, Warmogs is fine as recommended here, but you can also go Steadfast Heart, Redemption, even putting things like Sunfire Cape. Don't forget things about anti-heal. It could be really, really important, and if you end up having Sunfire or Morello, that's really good on Echo. If you can get the Kiana, it's really good, but chances are you're going to have to put like whatever 80 items that go onto Akali, and even then, Akali true damage is nice, but sometimes she's not that reliable because you end up just not having enough items for her, and she's going to be at 1 star while being contested by other people who are playing KDA or Karthus. So Akali is not the priority unless you're able to 2-star her. This is an example of how you can get like KDA with Crowd Diver because you have the Lilia and you have the Nika with the super fans. You can tech in this, but you can also just simply not play KDA instead and, you know, go for, say, the Aphelios or Rapid Fire, and Aphelios adds a little bit of a stun, so it's nice utility there. You're probably sensing a theme that Superfan in general is just really good for reroll, and that's pretty much going to be the case until they nerf it, if they nerf it. Slow roll at 6, and once you hit Senna 3, start pushing levels. Don't focus on 3-star anything else because in reality, Echo is going to be hard to 3-star, and you're not going to really focus on 3-star Lilia or Kennen. If you end up being in a situation where you hit Senna really early and you need to push levels and figure out what to play, if you get to 9, just play something like a Lucian instead of this Aphelios. Tech and Jazz if you really want to, but I care more about frontline, so you can play, you know, a really strong frontliner like a Lowy, for example, and really outfit your comp that way. Don't forget that true damage is also important to activate on some of your other units. So if you are in a spot where you have like an extra Tactician's Crown or a floating component, like, you know, just like a random, I don't know, like you have like a random like glove, just put it on like a Kiana or put it on this Kennen, just activate that true damage bonus because you get like an extra value from that. Think of it like a cybernetic buff from the augment, where if you're just putting an item onto it, gets a little bit of an extra bonus. Same thing. Annie reroll got a recent buff right before the launch, and this is a variation of the Annie reroll that's been recommended on the team builder, but there's actually like 4 different variations that you can play, and that's going to be just a common theme of pretty much this entire set. I'm going to keep saying like, hey, this is like one of like, you know, 4 ways you can play this composition. This is just a recommended way you can build into it, which is leaning into emo and less on Spellweaver. The idea of it is that by having a really good front line, Annie is going to be able to cast a lot, and that emo with the minus percentage of that mana ends up having her cast a lot. Annie is probably going to be the premier 1-cost reroll for the first initial patch of the set. She got a really big buff right before launch because she was underperforming for the majority of PvE. Annie is really strong with particularly having a mana plus AP setup with blue buff. You could also give her Jewel Gauntlet and Giant Slayer, but in reality, you just kind of want to give her a bunch of different items that are really powerful, like the Gunblade or an Archangels or whatnot. It's totally fine to just give her whatever as long as you have blue buff plus an AP unit. The interesting thing about Annie is that there's multiple variations, which is probably going to be the thing I say like the most about every comp this set. Which is like there's going to be multiple ways you can play it. But Annie can be played through, the vertical emo as you're seeing here, where you play, 4 emo, you play around Poppy, you get like some stats around your front line, and you end up playing like a Poppy Annie duo. You can also play around Spellweavers, and you can also play around like a KD variation that has her be dual carry with Ahri and maybe even Akali, and then you have like a bunch of AP pers that way. This is pretty straightforward. You usually play Annie when you have like a tier and a bunch of Annies and a headliner Annie early. You really want to make sure you play low eco and hit Annie 3 at 3-1. Don't level and focus on economy. Make sure you heavily econ early by loot streaking or making sure that you're prioritizing getting that gold interest. I don't care how it does. And make sure you hyper roll at 3-1 so you can get the Annie 3 online as soon as possible. The other variation that you can play if you're not playing around like the vertical emo version is just going into Spellweavers. You end up playing around Spellweavers. You end up playing around Superfan a lot because you end up having synergies that kind of tie in really, really nicely to it. So let's go into Superfan with this. And then Lilia and Nico. Drop this Vex, and then let's put in this Ahri. And as you can see, with the Spellweaver version, you can play like a KDA where you have like backline dual carry with Ahri, and you have Annie kind of popping off and maybe like doing some big damage. Just an example of what you can do. So yeah, you have some variations that you can play. Just really have fun with it, and more importantly, like make sure you hit that Annie early for tempo curve, and just fill out with it whatever makes sense with your augments. Similar to what we said before, by the way, is if you do end up finding a way to get an emo emblem, make sure you get this Karthus in with that emo emblem. Emo with a spat and a tier can be very, very strong. In this case, I would not try to prioritize necessarily play around like the KDA version. I'd probably instead try to prioritize getting Vex in and going for 4 emo this way. And in this case, you probably cut 2 Spellweaver, so Gragas goes out and likely this Echo. Yeah, this is like one variation that you can play as well. Another comp I want to talk about is Punk Reroll featuring Jinx and Pantheon. Jinx really wants Rageblade, Last Whisper, and an AD source. And it's pretty straightforward. You want to be rolling every single round starting from even stage 1. That's right. If you get Jinx and Vi in at 1-3 or Jinx and Twitch, then you're able to immediately start rolling on 1-4 even before your first augment. And that's important to do because you start snowballing the Punk bonus where every time you're spending this gold on a shop refresh, you're getting stronger with more health and more AD. I think what really makes this comp take off is the Punk emblem, which is built through a glove and a spatula. If you're able to get a Punk emblem, it's really strong on frontliners in particular if you give them the Guardian, because this Guardian scales with how much HP you have. And if you're re-rolling a bunch throughout the game, you're getting this extra Guardian bonus through that Punk emblem. And so make sure you're rolling every single turn no matter what. There's a little yellow icon to indicate that you get that 1 extra gold for that Punk reroll. Make sure you consume it. Another thing to think about with this comp with augments is that if you use something like a free reroll like Prismatic Ticket or Trade Sector, it doesn't actually get the Punk bonus until after you're done with all your free rerolls. So you use your free rerolls, pick up your units, and then you get one final roll, and on top of that, you get that Punk bonus. It's a little bit confusing at first to hear, but when you do it, you'll see what I mean. Basically, TLDR, make sure you get that discounted roll every single round. Pantheon will take tank items, and you generally want to play around Guardians. I think if you get 6 Guardian, it's usually my favorite setup around this. And 6 Guardian is pretty cheap because you just play around Eteric and you play around the Kennen. You can get Superfan in as well. So it's probably going to look something like this. And if you do end up going for 6 Guardian, I think you end up cutting Punk as well in most cases. But if you end up getting a Punk emblem and ends up being like a +1 Jinx, try to get this Punk onto Yorick if you can. Yorick with Punk is disgustingly good. The other variant that you can play if you're not playing around the Guardian variant is to play around Country. Because you have things like this Thresh that anchor you, you can actually play around Samira really easily. And the easiest way to link that is just to have Samira, and then you end up playing like a really nice clean set of 8 units, which is 4 Punk, 3 Country, and you get like all this extra Guardian stuff. This is a Mumu is optional, by the way. You can cut her as well. So this this is what it's looking like when you play 4 punk and you play the country variant. You play the 4 core punk units, and then you just splash in these 3 country units. So that way they tie in. You get the Executioner with Twitch, the Mosher with Vi, the Guardian with the Pantheon. The 8th unit could just be whatever. It just really doesn't matter as long as you fill in your synergies correctly. Oftentimes playing around that headliner bonus, like maybe get +1 rapid fire cannon instead. The last thing I want to talk about is the Twin Terror variant, where you can actually just play 2 of everything on punk. It is very, very good. Specifically, units you care about are going to be the units that's holding items. You still want to go for 2 Pantheons and 2 Vi's as your first priority. And this can be like what you roll at level 6. And then at level 7, you can start adding in things like the Twitch and the Vi later on. Twin Terror is the new bonus that you get for playing 2 of the same kind of unit. Double Trouble is no longer in the game, so you call it Twin Terror. People are still going to call it Double Trouble, so hopefully you don't get that mixed up. Yeah, make sure you prioritize Jinx and Pantheon as your first things that you're duplicating in Twin Terror, and then go for Vi and Twitch afterwards. This is probably the best Twin Terror comp in the game, although there's probably a couple of variants that are going to pop up as well. A lot of times when you play this comp, you might even hit Jinx 3 like really, really early, or you might hit things like Vi 3 really, really early. The thing about this comp is that you're just going to be rolling like throughout the entire game, and you're going to not press the level button until you hit Jinx 3. So make sure that you're not going to be like, well, I hit Vi 3 and I only have 3 copies of Jinx. I probably just push levels to 6 and I roll for Pantheon. That's not really the thing. That's not what you do in this reroll comp specific. Just stay exactly where you are, hold the fort, and make sure that you just roll until you hit that Jinx 3. So there you have it. What I believe to be the best comps to climb on launch day here for Set 10 Remix Rumble. That is just the S tier comps though. The A tier is twice as big. And so I didn't want to make this video like 1.5, 2 hours long. That's going to be in the next video where I cover a big chunk of compositions that are just more situational and less likely to be dominant based off of what we saw in PBE. So make sure you keep your eyes peeled, like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video as well as Challenger.